Welkom bij Gewikt en Gewogen, de podcast van de Hoven en Rechtbanken Antwerpen-Limburg. Ik ben Luc de Cler. Vandaag hebben we een Engelstalige gast en daarom is het vandaag niet Gewikt en Gewogen, maar Weighing the Arguments. Today we continue the conversation we started during the 50-year anniversary event of the Antwerp Court of Appeal, where we invited leading thinkers to look ahead at the justice system of tomorrow. One of our speakers that evening made a particularly strong impression. Professor Brian Berry, Associate Professor at the School of Law of Trinity College Dublin. He researches how judges judge, literally. His work brings together psychology, empirical legal studies, and the fast-evolving world of artificial intelligence. Brian studies where AI can genuinely support courts, where it risks undermining trust, and how we can build systems that are both efficient and profoundly fair. In this episode, we go deeper into those questions. What can AI offer to courts under pressure? How do we safeguard transparency, judicial independence, and open justice? And what does the court of the future actually look like, not in theory, but in practice? Brian combines international expertise with a remarkably clear and human perspective on technology. It's a conversation that matters, especially as justice systems across Europe face rising caseloads, limited resources, and high expectations from the public. Professor Brian Berry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So perhaps we can start with your path into this field. You began by studying how judges actually decide cases, the cognitive and behavioral side of judging. How did that lead you into the world of artificial intelligence?
Sure. I suppose just to go back one step, I trained and practiced as a commercial litigation practitioner, solicitor in Dublin for a short while, but I was fascinated by the way that non-legal factors can affect how judges think, how they behave in courtrooms, and I made it, I suppose, something of a mission to learn about all of the research that's out there that actually looks into the data of all these extra legal factors that can affect how judges think and decide cases. And one particular feature of that was the overlay of psychology and behavioral science research applied to the judicial field. And then over time, as technology evolved in courts, and particularly around the time of the pandemic, you start to see different modes of justice, and you start to think about what are the consequences of video conferencing hearings in judicial systems, and how does that, I suppose, affect how the process is operated, how judges deliberate, how they think. So I started to think about the implications of different technologies in that context. And then, of course, with the rise of artificial intelligence, which was always there operating in the background, that, I suppose, serves as part of the architecture for how judges think and how they decide cases. And artificial intelligence, particularly with the elevation or the application of generative AI now, really does have profound applications. And we're beginning to see how informally that is, in a sort of an ad hoc way, really beginning to infiltrate that judicial process. And we're seeing so many tools around the globe now that have been there more than a decade sometimes, integral to judicial decision-making processes in so many jurisdictions, and we can chat about some of them. And now, of course, that additional layer of ChatGPT and what that means for how judging is done. So it's an absolutely fascinating field. So it's that interaction between technology and cognitive science applied to the judicial field that really excites me. Mm-hmm. And I'm also quite concerned about a lot of it as well, it has to be said. So there's so many use cases, some of it good, some of it really quite perilous. And as a community, I think, of practitioners or scholars, we really have to involve ourselves in that conversation before things really do get out of hand.
Mm-hmm. Because it's typically with technology, people are moving very fast by adopting these things, and they're probably also breaking things.
Move fast and break things. Yeah. Who said that?
Yeah, and that's good for startups, but not for courts.
No, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And there's a reason why we have rituals, and there's a reason why we demand high standards of process. Howsoever they may be realized, the fact is that those standards are there, and we do still have to aspire to them. And artificial intelligence isn't a get-out clause. It's not something to circumvent that ritual, that sense of importance. When you experience a legal need as an individual citizen, you need to feel respected, you need to feel dignified. And that's integral, with or without artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Next question. You've said before that courts are facing growing pressures. You mentioned it yesterday. Time, caseload complexity, limited resources. Many listeners will recognize that in Belgium as well. To what extent is the rise of AI a response to those pressures?
Well, there's potential there, and we're starting to see artificial intelligence tools integrated into case management systems, integrated even generative AI into drafting very short paragraphs or template modules that you can insert into the text of judgments, for instance. And I think artificial intelligence, if we go back a step, it can actually precipitate more litigation. It can precipitate or bring about more written material, right? So it's a content creator, for better or worse. So anecdotally, you hear judges saying, it seems that lawyers' submissions are now becoming extraordinarily long, or I've chatted to judges in different jurisdictions who've expressed their concern that the likes of ChatGPT could bring about a situation where more self-represented litigants feel empowered, I suppose, to use that technology to go to court, to use it as a mechanism for circumventing going to a lawyer in the first place, perhaps understandably because they can't afford one, which means that there's more content, there's more litigation because the technology is available. And then kind of paradoxically, if you like, there is potential there for the tools and this technology to be used to streamline those processes once litigation is up and running. Through, as I say, case management or generative AI at different stages in the process. But you know, a key theme here, and it's something we can touch upon later, is thinking about helping litigants understand the journey, what maybe the consequences are, navigating that with better information through appropriate use of artificial intelligence. And I see that as low-hanging fruit. I see that as a really useful way to maybe think about integrating this technology across the entire court journey, geared towards the court user, as distinct from maybe the more perilous considerations of using, for instance, recommender systems for sentencing, which you hear about regularly. So there are opportunities here as well as challenges. In almost every jurisdiction, I think you're beginning to see, you know, the big word is hallucination, right? So the integration of fake cases, poorly reasoned argumentation on laws that don't exist, and there's actually a database online of cases where it's mentioned, and the number of jurisdictions where this is happening is absolutely staggering. But that's on the lawyer's side, and inevitably, you know, I'm a legal educator. I look at young law students coming in, and they're grappling with this just as much as we are. But that permeates right the way through to the top, and you're starting to see examples of, for instance, hallucinated cases and substantive errors in judgments. There's recent examples from courts in Mississippi and New Jersey, which is really troubling. And as with any fast-evolving technology, there's always the technology first, and then the rapid regulatory response. So guidelines are starting to proliferate from all courts and all law societies and bar councils around the globe, warning their bodies that they represent of the perils and of this technology, how to not use it, to use it in very constrained ways, of course. But it's always a response. It's the nature of regulating technology. It necessarily responds. And the question is how quickly that response can come in and how useful and accurate that response can be to the technology because it's moving so quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that. Actually, the fact that the courts are not fast adopters is maybe in this case a large benefit. I mean, the first movers are paying the price.
That's true. I think what can happen is you see ready adoption of technology, say, in financial sectors or even healthcare or education context, perhaps. But what can happen is, in one sense, the trajectory of that can be resistance, and then almost overnight, wholesale, if not adoption, a realization almost, we must start using this really, really quickly. I mean, there's really quite telling data from, for instance, from Colombia emerging, a recent survey done of hundreds, if not thousands of Colombian judges about where a sizable minority of them are using ChatGPT and general purpose tools that are out there in the public to even research cases, to research legislation, which is, of course, that substantive analysis should really be far more controlled and using appropriate sources. And I'm not necessarily singling out that jurisdiction for any particular reason other than the data is there. I suspect that is something that does occur in other judicial settings as well. Mm-hmm. So there is a sense that not a lot happens in the so-called law tech field for many years. We are inherently cautious as a domain, or conservative, and then almost very quickly things can happen. And I think just even in the last 6 months, there is a sense that that's really kicking off. So now is a very important moment in time where I think as a community, we really have to reflect on that.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's talk about the opportunities a bit more specifically. Where do you see AI offering tangible, safe, and meaningful improvements for courts today?
Well, it's a case of looking at who it's for, first and foremost. So if we go back to what courts are about, they are for the citizens, for the organizations who need to be in courts. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But if we think internally within courts, it is a system, it is a journey that needs to be managed. There's triaging of people's court journeys. There are court offices with many, many people undertaking tasks that could be, to some degree, automated. And I'm not talking about substantive areas of law or legal argumentation or anything like that, but the basic triaging of cases could be performed, undertaken far more seamlessly, I think, using this technology appropriately. Basic legal information for litigants, we can maybe speak to that a little bit more as well. But within the courts, there are opportunities to make those processes more seamless and to free up human resources and the people within those court systems, working within those courts, to concentrate on the more important detail and nuance to progress cases and leave the more rudimentary throughput and processing of cases to this technology. So that's one very, I think, obvious use case. We can go all the way up to that consideration of how it could be integrated into decision-making as well. That's where the controversies can really start to emerge. And actually using it in a judge's deliberation chambers becomes risky, but there is maybe some degree of consideration necessary there as well, given that it's already being used in many, many different jurisdictions. Just by way of example, the Council of Europe have what's called the Resource Centre on Cyber Justice and Artificial Intelligence, and they provide a database identifying tools around Europe for both lawyers, for public information, for judges, and there are already, it would seem, at least within that database, 34 decision support tools specifically for judges in European jurisdictions, most of them based on artificial intelligence technology. So this is happening. We see it, the rise of it in China as well, where the government has mandated integrating artificial intelligence systems for decision-making pretty much wholesale across the board for, I suppose that the agenda there is to make decision-making more consistent. There are tools that are effectively to provide alarm bells or buffers or guardrails when a judge makes a decision that strays or deviates from the norm, which is very conceptually, I think, risky. There is understandably, we put guardrails around judges in the terms in different ways through perhaps suggested levels of compensation in specific cases and prescribing ranges of sentences. But to demand that a tool, an artificial intelligence tool, can, I suppose, inspect the work of the judge, that raises profound questions about judicial independence and the role of governments and courts as well. So it's even being used there to generate the text of judgments in so-called simple cases in one province in China, for example. So that's really the thin end of the wedge. That isn't common, but China is a jurisdiction that's thinking about this and integrating it, actually acting on it, not just thinking about it. And then at the same time, you see it's hard to get a full grasp of what is going on the ground through as an academic researcher in China, but we're seeing more and more literature. We do see use case examples of people resolving very, very small compensation claims. My broadband wasn't working or whatever it might be, something really low key where the citizen, while they're aggrieved, it isn't the biggest deal in the whole world, and they're able to have dialogue with the other side via an app, a form of sort of online dispute resolution, but that is triaged and managed using AI technology. And you do begin to wonder if it's cautiously developed with the courts. I think that's a really crucial theme. Maybe there is something in that. Maybe that is genuinely useful for the citizen, and it gets them to the result that they want. And at the same time, it saves resources. It's efficient. So they're just some of the angles, and I haven't even begun to look into how it could help litigants on their court journey as well. There's so much to it, so much potential, but at the same time, it must be done properly and appropriately.
Mm-hmm. And from just a purely an information standpoint, I mean, when we are trying to inform the public about our proceedings and how they can address the court, etc., could it play a role in that domain?
Absolutely. I think that's really, really where this should be. This is the first port of call, I think, for any courts around Europe. The technology is sufficiently advanced and relatively low cost that we can absolutely think about this technology as a means of a first source of information, if you like, to make that initial consideration on the part of a citizen. Okay, I have a problem. I think I have a legal need. What do I do? So basic questions at the start of any court journey. And there's really potential there. There's just a glimpse of some of that technology. There is in Portugal a tool called the Practical Guide to Justice, which is essentially, it looks and feels like ChatGPT. It's a conversational AI interface based on the same technology, but it's controlled. So the data that's it's based on ensures that it's tailored information. It's narrowly confined to the domain of court work, court processes, what to do if you have a legal need. But there is this boundary condition that can sometimes be fuzzy. And what I mean by that is a tool like that must never stray beyond providing legal information into the territory of providing strategic legal advice. That's the role of a lawyer, or if you're self-represented, that's up to you. It's not the role of the courts to tell you what your best strategy is. Having a conversation about what to do and where to go, rather than sifting through technical legal jargon contained in poorly formatted PDF documents, is absolutely the way forward. It's still providing the same information that you get if you had the time and the wherewithal to navigate all those PDFs and technical legal jargon, but do it in a far more seamless way. And then, to take a litigant on their journey, if you think of it at pre-trial, I mean, there's so many, this is all about giving control and agency to someone who wants a dignified process. We can guide inexperienced litigants through how to file a claim. even the structure of the document could be used. You're not talking about Word document templates anymore. You're thinking about documents that can flag errors, that ensure compliance with formalities, so that the court office doesn't have to engage in correspondence back and forth. You're talking about AI-based apps for document exchange once the case management process is underway. You're talking about all sorts of different things at trial, like how to get to the courtroom, where in the building your courtroom is, basic reminders, procedural guidance, transcripts of the hearing, plain language summaries, even interactive flowcharts on next steps. When the judgment comes, what this judgment means for you. A one-page document that complements the actual work product of the court, the judgment, but nevertheless allows the litigant to understand that process better. And I mean, when I talk to judges, and you see it in the literature as well, when they speak about what a good judgment looks like, a good judgment should help the loser to understand why they lost. And that's kind of a benchmark. And of course, artificial intelligence could be considered in that, providing hyperlinks to complex cases that are mentioned in a judgment, flowcharts of the judicial reasoning contained in it, plain language summaries, and all of this could be initially generated by artificial intelligence and then reviewed, scrutinized, and approved before being released to the litigant themselves. So then what are the appeal routes? What are the timelines? All of that information can be made more palatable, more comprehensible, if we think about these tools in that context. And that's, I think, promising. I don't see. Sure, there's some. There are absolutely concerns about, well, we have to make absolutely sure that the information it provides is resolutely accurate. You really do have to constrain artificial intelligence systems for those use cases, because ultimately they will, litigants, I would suspect, will generally see that information and take it as accurate and take it at face value because it's coming from the court system itself. So, a key feature in this is really, really making sure that the people who know this system inside out are absolutely involved in the development, the deployment, and even crucially, I think, the maintenance and updating of those systems to make sure it is always accurate, insofar as is possible, as much of the time as possible.
What I'm hearing is that if AI can assist the judge more with, the data, the case management, etc., it opens up time to be more of a person.
Yeah.
And to show that side more and to have time to contemplate more as a person on a case.
Sure.
What I see in a lot of courts is that the caseload is so massive that people don't have a lot of time to contemplate.
No, absolutely.
They're taking the right decisions. I'm not arguing that. But it's in a different mode.
Yeah. And I come from a jurisdiction where the ratio of judges to citizens is it's really quite concerning, and caseloads are extraordinarily high. There's data from the UK judicial attitude surveys indicating enormous amounts of stress, particularly at the lower tiers of the judicial system. There, by stress, I mean, I suppose, work-related stress on the part of judges. And that can have an effect on how judges can perform as decision makers. They are called judges because they judge, because they decide things. So the more that we can facilitate that contemplation, as you put it, the better. And if we can integrate AI in the more procedural, humdrum, rudimentary elements of getting from A to B to the point where a judge can really engage with those written submissions pre-trial, or really think about the potential for alternative ways of reasoning a case in their deliberation chambers afterwards, then you can actually enhance that capacity for a judge to engage in a particular case. I mean, I mentioned earlier that written submissions maybe are becoming more lengthier, perhaps, although I don't have data on this, perhaps because generative AI could be fueling that. So artificial intelligence could be used for a judge before trial when they're reading through the submissions to do really simple things like auto-paginate documents, index it, hyperlink materials, point to instances where both sides are talking about a specific provision in law, and highlight parts of those written submissions that really are at the crux of the legal argument on both sides. And that doesn't distract, I don't think, from a judge's role to analyse the materials and to engage and contemplate those arguments. But it's just a way of helping judges to structure that crucial written information before they go into a hearing. And even, indeed, it can assist with perhaps, I suppose, concentrating the judge's mind on the kinds of questions that they want to ask and need to ask at trial. You know, the reason I'm making these suggestions is because they are based on the full range of empirical evidence available to us now that judges, like everyone else, are human. And it is a cognitively stressful environment. It puts strain on your cognitive capacities, and judges are trained and they have expertise, and it's an extremely difficult job to think systematically all the time. And come all the way back to the behavioral science, behavioral economics literature of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, and this idea of thinking fast and slow. We demand that judges think slow all the time, and the demands put on them are such that they necessarily have to think fast to get through their day. Mm-hmm. The problem is, well, how exactly is the artificial intelligence tool going to do that? Will it ultimately be another injection of an external bias in its own right, because the artificial intelligence tool is asking the sorts of questions that, because of the data that it relies on, may in its own right have some degree of bias or concern?
If that's your argument that it is the case now, evidently the data set we use to train the AI will contain the same errors.
Inevitably, right? And we see very worrying data from, for instance, the Compass tool. There's a lot of back and forth in the research literature around whether there is bias embedded in the data that feeds into that tool predicting what's called a recidivism risk score between 1 to 10. So it asks over 100 questions, profiling the convicted criminal, asking the prosecutor questions. It asks really quite extraordinary questions. I've seen PDFs of those questions. This might be somewhat dated, but asking about their upbringing, was there drugs in their family and environment, do you feel angry? All of those questions are asked by that system, and that adjusts perhaps the risk score. Personally, I just fundamentally disagree with that approach, and it's actually, as an architecture.
And this is being used today?
Yeah. Now, I don't want to absolutely say that those specific questions are feeding into the analysis used today, but I have seen versions of that document, that question document.
It's quite surprising,
from a number of years ago now, yeah. And there's also research suggesting that if you reduce the questions down to 1 or 2 questions rather than the 130 odd or whatever, that it basically comes up with the same score, right? So the difficulty that I have with systems like that, not least because it's at the really, really serious end of, all justice is serious, but that is a really critical juncture in legal process. Sentencing is absolutely, it's vital we get that right. But it's the very fact that it produces a score that anchors the expectation of everyone involved, and anchors the judge's thinking on it. And sure, they're well within their rights to ignore that score, but that's not the way the human brain works. So there's the anchoring effect. There's, automation bias. We have a propensity, perhaps, to trust what these tools are telling us. So what I'm talking about a few minutes ago are tools that specifically do not suggest a recommended outcome, but rather give the judge some bandwidth, some latitude to explore the decision that they're going to arrive at. So it's kind of flipping it on its head to some degree to explode reasoning rather than implode it to a particular point. And I've had conversations with different academics about this. There's head of a research institute in Bologna on legal informatics, Francesco Contini, who talks about this construct, this exploding reasoning and artificial intelligence facilitating that. So it's controversial. It's a provocative angle maybe to say that artificial intelligence could be used as kind of a sounding board, a devil's advocate, but there is enough psychological research out there to suggest that we need to consider this. And judges are enormously reflective. I regularly give training to judicial bodies around Europe, and they're enormously reflective and understanding of their vulnerabilities to these inclinations to rely on intuitive system one thinking. And there's nothing wrong with intuition until it becomes an irrational factor in the decision that materializes. Inevitably, you're going to have judges who completely understandably say, we really, really want to resist anything that is going to infiltrate all that training, all that expertise, all that that sense of human justice. It's a compromise. It's not good enough. And then there are other judges who will advocate for it.
Yeah, one of the things you touched upon previously is the dangers of opacity. I think that's really relevant now. So a lot of these systems are black boxes. We don't actually know how they come up with things and how they generate the output they do. That seems like a very big problem and probably a large explanation for the resistance of a lot of the people from the courts.
Absolutely, and that's why I think systems such as recommender systems are so dangerous. If there is just a case in point, literally a court case, Eric Loomis, who is a criminal defendant, he was convicted of a crime in the state of Wisconsin. He took a court case saying that the use of this compass tool was a breach of due process because he couldn't understand how the algorithm arrived at a particular output that the judge relied on, this risk recidivism score. And part of the argument was that the algorithm was protected by trade secret. And maybe this is to some degree an oversimplification, but the ruling, first of all, said, well, the judge retains discretion to rely or not rely on that particular output. So the judge makes the decision. But secondary to that, there isn't an inequality of arms. The amount of information as regards or about that tool is the same for the litigant as it is for the court. It's not like we are possessed of more information about this tool. So this isn't a situation where we are, there's a information asymmetry here. Now, to me, the subtext there is none of us really understands it, so everything's okay.
It's even more worrying, yeah.
Right? And Loomis appealed, or tried to get the appeal to the Supreme Court. They refused it to hear that case. So that's a judgment of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. It was a long number of years ago now, I think 2016.
To me, that sounds like a complete violation of some of the standards that we apply. Transparency, for one.
Just provide explanations generally about artificial intelligence and then expect that that is enough. the reality is that these tools are enormously complex, and it's very difficult with the best will in the world to understand what's going on underneath the hood. That said, again, it comes back to use cases. If these tools are only being used to facilitate human thinking, then that hopefully may mitigate some of the concern. Whereas recommender tools, that's where the danger really lies, I think. Anything we can do to mitigate that is a project worth advancing. But there's a critical piece in the jigsaw here, and that is the reality that some of these tools, most of the time, will just be not transparent. They just will have opacity by their technical nature. And whether explanations foster genuine comprehension or understanding of the parts of the person who's at the receiving end of a decision assisted by one of these tools, or whether anyone can actually do anything useful with the fact that the information about the tool is out there in the public domain, that's an open question. So we have to think about use cases. That's really, really where I see this. Use cases and also co-design with the legal community.
Co-design and ownership by the legal community, or is that not?
Well, I would instinctively think that that is crucial. I've had some really interesting conversations with other academics about these findings, and someone said to me, well, if the court is the authoritative institution here, if we see them as an authority figure, and if they are electing to go to a technology company, if they are electing to get a system picked by the government, if they are electing to work themselves with experts, then that's their choice. And people might still see it as the court's taking agency over how they develop these technologies. And really, that in its own right is a decision taken by the courts. And, well, they're the authority, and we should trust that they are making the best call. They're picking the big technology company because they're the best people to build these systems, et cetera. So maybe that's the intermediary here.
How could that corrode the independence of the courts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the best foot forward, aside from the use case thing, which I've spoken to a good bit, is to consider how judges, how court users, how sophisticated, experienced litigation practitioners must be involved in the process of developing these tools in the first place, and crucially maintaining them. Co-design, workshopping these systems along with the AI developers. If we have a situation where the legal community says, okay, we have this great idea, and then just hand over the development exercise to AI developers and say, build me that system, that's just not going to work. It comes down to testing. It comes down to judges interacting with prototype versions of these tools. It comes back to measuring legitimacy and trust, as I mentioned, on a pilot basis before you get to a point where you actually integrate it into the system. So make sure that the data doesn't present, or sorry, the data doesn't have inherent biases in it that end up exacerbating those biases, or fundamental inaccuracies in, say, legal information tools that I mentioned in the Portuguese example. You'd expect and demand that the people who know these systems and know what information should be provided are the very ones who are auditing it and making sure that it's accurate from beginning, middle, and when it's actually deployed, right the way through to it being out there in the real world. So that's perhaps a way to rein in that concern over, well, we're farming out justice to a technology company or whatever. We need to think about the involvement of the community right the way through the process.
Okay. You answered a lot of questions I had in mind, so thank you for that. I'm thinking about kind of wrapping up, but there was just one more question I really wanted to ask you, is that how do you imagine the court of the future looks like in 10 years' time? Because 10 years, it seems like not that much, but technology is so fast-paced that that's an eternity.
Honestly, that's just crystal ball gazing. I mean, I think even the best experts or the best prophets in this space maybe wouldn't have anticipated quite how explosive ChatGPT would have been in, say, October 2022, just before its launch. So it's very, very difficult to see what the direction of travel is here.
But for example, you mentioned triage systems. That would be standard, I suppose.
Yeah.
Better communication with citizens seems logical, but perhaps also improved access to justice. You mentioned it.
Absolutely. And I mean, sorry, I didn't go down that track in responding to that question, I suppose, because, you know, those tools are in the here and now, right? There are examples of those. I'm cherry picking. I'm describing a journey, but really what I'm doing is cherry picking from actual systems that, you know, individually are out there in different courts, and policymakers and AI developers are working on those tools. So, yeah, absolutely. I think that, as I come back to that phrase, low-hanging fruit, there's definitely a use case there to improve that court journey. I think case triaging, helping court staff get through their workload more manageably, provision of legal information, the Portuguese example of the large language model.
Hybrid hearings?
Potentially. I mean, there's a whole other body of research on how that impacts on the ritual and how people feel dignified through those processes.
So we need to find these niches and start experimenting in those niches with some amount of technology to really get a governance model.
Absolutely. And with, you know,
building experience.
Cautiously, with circumspection, making sure that the people who really know what people need and want are in the room. And I think that genuinely includes the public. I think we have to develop these tools and put them to the public in hypothetical contexts. You know, that's part of my research agenda, is to really look at what goes to the root of legitimacy here, how people feel about this technology. There's all of the technological concerns, all of the bias concerns, all of the how do you get the right data, how do you weight the algorithm, etc. This isn't a contradiction. I see AI as facilitating those moments of dignity in a process where ultimately, if you do need to be in a courtroom and you need to be able to stare a jury in the eye or a judge in the eye, that you can have those moments if that's what you need. If that's your version of justice. I don't think we should discard that in any sense. Mm-hmm. But there are many routes and forms of justice, and it's a case of citizen inquiry, citizen participation to understand what justice looks like in different contexts, and on that basis then explore what the technology should be.
Yeah, sounds good. So one last question, really the last question. What do you think should remain purely human, no matter how advanced AI becomes?
Maybe it just comes back to what I've just mentioned there. Justice is a human business. Courts always have to have that human element there. There is a reason why we have all this ritual and I don't know, the architecture, everything, the magnificent court building here or down the road. There's a reason why we invest in that. And I think giving citizens that sense that they can ultimately go into a court building and hear and be heard in front of a human. It's that moment of trial, that hearing part that I think is absolutely crucial to maintain. Just the option of it, the opportunity of it. And we can have AI operating in many different ways around that. We can have options to help litigants not have to go down that route. And the reality is that, certainly in my jurisdiction, hardly anyone ever gets to hearing anyway, or gets to trial anyway. And that is not necessarily a good reflection on, you know, the broader system of justice. But ensuring that we never, ever deprive them of that opportunity if they want to go down that road, I think is absolutely critical.